On our anniversary morning, I discovered why my husband changed the locks early. I woke before sunrise on our anniversary. The house unusually still, air smelling faintly of lemon cleaner. The clock glowed 5:42, and I lay listening to pipes tick, telling myself quiet meant peace, not warning on this gentle morning alone. Anniversaries usually arrived with plans and laughter, but that morning felt thin, like sound swallowed by carpet. I stayed still, feeling the chill through sheets, noticing how my phone sat face down, silent beside the lamp, untouched, waiting, somehow heavy. I told myself it was nerves, that milestones make mornings fragile. 12 years together had taught me routines, and ours was simple. Coffee first, then cards, then the day opening slowly with familiar warmth, shared smiles, easy jokes, always expected. I swung my legs out, toes brushing cool hardwood, and reached for my robe. The hallway light was off, darker than usual, and I noticed the silence again, thicker now, pressing gently against my ribs, slowing breath, for no reason. From the bedroom doorway, I called his name softly, expecting a sleepy answer. Nothing replied, not even the furnace hum, and the absence landed oddly, like a misstep on stairs that made my heart pause, recalibrate, then move carefully again. I padded toward the kitchen, counting sounds to steady myself. Refrigerator, window, kettle, sink. Each familiar shape waited, unchanged, yet the room felt staged, as if reset overnight by careful hands, leaving space where warmth usually lived, quietly, unclaimed, today. I brewed coffee anyway, breathing steam, grounding myself with ritual. The mug was chipped at the handle, a gift from him years ago, and the memory warmed me briefly before slipping away, replaced by alertness, a sharpened edge, behind comfort. I checked the calendar magnet, red heart circling the date, smiling at its optimism. We had planned dinner downtown, a small surprise, nothing extravagant, just time together after work, candles, familiar booth, clinking glasses, easy laughter, promises, unspoken, shared. Then, my phone buzzed at last, a delivery notification, not his message, and disappointment pricked. I set it down, noticing the screen smudge he hated, and felt strangely watched by the quiet, by rooms holding breath, by thoughts aligning, sharpening, alone. I went to the front door for the paper, habit guiding me without thought. The handle looked new, metal brighter, and when I turned it, the click sounded wrong, flatter, final, unfamiliar, like punctuation, ending a sentence midstream abruptly. There. I tried again, slower, listening for give, but resistance met me calmly. My pulse lifted, ears warming, and I laughed once softly, because it felt unreal, like a rehearsal, a trick, a misunderstanding, easily fixed, any second, surely now, please. I stepped back, noticing the fresh deadbolt, the tiny scratch where paint hadn't cured. The air smelled different near the door, metallic, and my confidence thinned as questions crowded, stacking quietly, patient, demanding, answers I didn't have, yet, today, suddenly. I checked my keys, palms slick, and tried the back entrance, hoping for embarrassment. Same answer, the same polite refusal, and my chest tightened with a slow dread that crept upward, cooling breath, narrowing focus, dimming plans, softening hope, quietly. Standing there, robe belt loose, coffee cooling inside, I felt exposed and small. This was our house, our morning, and yet something fundamental had shifted beneath me without noise, without warning, leaving imbalance. A tilt I couldn't correct, yet, alone. I wrapped my arms around myself, breathing until steadier thoughts returned. Whatever this was, it required calm, not panic, and I promised to meet the day gently with patience, attention, dignity, curiosity, and the quiet courage mornings sometimes ask for. I stood by the door longer than made sense, staring at the unfamiliar lock like it might explain itself. Morning light crept through the frosted glass, pale and indifferent, illuminating fingerprints that weren't mine, and I felt a strange embarrassment, as if the house itself had rejected me. I told myself there had to be a simple reason. Contractors, maybe, or a safety upgrade he forgot to mention. My mind worked quickly to protect him, to protect us, smoothing sharp edges before they could cut. The way I always had, the way love trains you to. I checked my phone again, thumb hovering, then tapping his name. One ring, then voicemail, his recorded voice calm and distant, and I hung up before the beep, unwilling to leave evidence of panic I hadn't earned yet, not this early. The porch felt colder than it should have, wood pressing through thin slippers. A neighbor's sprinkler hissed somewhere down the block, normal sounds continuing without me, and that normalcy stung more than the lock, like the world hadn't noticed I'd been displaced. I walked around the side of the house, scanning windows for movement. Curtains were drawn exactly the way I'd left them. Furniture shadows familiar, mocking, and the realization settled that this wasn't a mistake made in haste, but a choice made carefully without me. My thoughts scattered, then reassembled into questions. When had he done this, and why before today? The timing pressed on me, heavy and deliberate, turning our anniversary into a marker. Not a celebration, something chosen, something intentional. I sat on the porch step, coffee mug still warm in my hand, and tried to breathe evenly. I didn't want to cry outside, visible, vulnerable, so I focused on the steam rising, watched it fade into the cool air, practiced disappearing myself. Memories surfaced uninvited, of other mornings when he'd surprised me. Pancakes, notes on the counter, a kiss pressed into my hair, and I clung to those images like proof that I wasn't crazy, that love had lived here, even if it had moved out early. I told myself not to jump ahead. No accusations, no stories invented from fear, just facts. The locks were changed. He wasn't answering. Everything else was unknown, and I repeated that silently, like a mantra meant to keep me from breaking. Still, isolation crept in, subtle and sharp. I realized no one else knew where I was standing, how suddenly alone I felt, how exposed. This was my marriage, my problem, and I'd always handled things quietly, without outside noise, without witnesses. I scrolled through our message history, looking for reassurance. Yesterday's texts were normal, almost cheerful, plans confirmed, hearts exchanged, nothing hinting at disruption. That normalcy felt cruel now, like a performance that ended without a curtain call. I considered calling my sister, then stopped. I didn't have words yet, and I didn't want her alarm coloring my own. Once spoken aloud, fear grows roots, and I wasn't ready to give this moment that kind of permanence. Instead, I stood and tried the door again, slower this time, listening closely. The lock didn't budge, solid and final, and something inside me shifted, a quiet acceptance forming, not surrender, but recognition that explanations would come later. I noticed then how neatly the porch had been swept, how intentional everything looked. This wasn't chaos or anger. It was order. That detail unsettled me more than rage would have, because order requires planning, foresight, emotional distance I hadn't sensed. I walked to my car, keys trembling slightly, and sat behind the wheel without starting it. The house loomed in front of me, familiar and suddenly unreachable, and I realized I wasn't just locked out of rooms, but out of conversations, decisions, truths. As the sun rose higher, warming the windshield, I felt the weight of being excluded settle in my chest. Whatever waited inside that house, whatever explanation he believed sufficient, I understood one thing clearly. This morning had redrawn the boundaries of my life that I thought about our beginning, how ordinary it had seemed at the time. We met in a grocery store aisle, arguing playfully over cereal, both laughing too loudly, both surprised by how easy conversation felt, how quickly comfort replaced caution between us without fear, expectation, or hesitation on that day. I was younger then, certain love meant stability and shared direction. He seemed grounded, reliable, someone who liked routines and promises. I admired that steadiness, mistaking predictability for safety, assuming consistency meant loyalty, never imagining how quietly people can rewrite intentions over time when comfort replaces curiosity, trust goes unquestioned. Our marriage grew through practical things, not grand gestures. Mortgage papers, weekend errands, family holidays, shared responsibilities layered into something solid. I believed love lived in showing up, day after day, keeping small promises, answering calls, coming home on time, choosing us repeatedly even when days felt ordinary, quiet, safe. He supported my career, or so I thought, encouraging from a distance. He preferred calm evenings, early nights, predictable schedules. I adjusted easily, proud of our balance, unaware how often I softened myself to preserve harmony, how rarely I asked what he gave up in return for us, truly, ever. Friends called us steady, dependable, even boring in a flattering way. I wore that label proudly. Drama belonged to other couples, not us. We communicated calmly, planned carefully, solved problems logically, and I mistook that smoothness for depth, believing calm meant connection without questioning silence, distance, compromise, or imbalance growing. We built traditions slowly, annual trips, favorite restaurants, inside jokes repeated until they lost edges. I trusted the rhythm of our life. Predictability soothed me, and I didn't notice when routine stopped being shared and started being controlled. Guided quietly by his preferences alone, without discussion, negotiation, resistance, awareness, consent. I handled most emotional labor, smoothing conflicts, remembering birthdays, maintaining family ties. He appreciated it, or seemed to. I felt useful, needed, secure in contribution. I never asked whether he noticed the imbalance, or if my effort made things easier for him while my own needs quietly shrank, unnoticed, unspoken. Looking back, I see how often I deferred. Decisions about money, timing, even renovations subtly shifted toward his comfort. I called it compromise. I told myself marriages required flexibility, that love meant yielding sometimes, unaware how consistently sometimes became always, without protest from me, quietly, patiently, invisibly, gradually, steadily, fully. He disliked confrontation, framing it as maturity. I admired that, too. We rarely argued loudly, but silence filled gaps arguments never did. I learned to read moods, adjust tone, anticipate needs, believing harmony was success, not realizing silence can be a tool when power remains unchallenged, unexamined, comfortable, protected, intact. Our home reflected his tastes more than mine. Neutral colors, minimal clutter, controlled calm. I adapted, telling myself comfort mattered more than expression. I packed pieces of myself into closets and corners, assuming love meant shrinking gracefully, never noticing how empty rooms echoed later when voices fade, presence thins, disappears. I trusted his words because actions appeared consistent. Bills paid, schedules kept, anniversaries acknowledged. Reliability became my measure of safety. I didn't consider what happened behind that reliability, what conversations I wasn't part of, what decisions were finalized before I arrived quietly, deliberately, privately, without discussion, consent, warning, pause, explanation. Family admired him, praised his steadiness. I defended him reflexively, filling gaps, translating silences. Being his partner felt like stewardship. I believed protecting his image protected us both, unaware how often I erased myself to maintain that polished, convincing narrative presented outwardly, carefully, strategically, selectively, repeatedly, patiently, loyally, unquestioningly, always. There were moments of unease I dismissed quickly. A hesitation before answering, a private smile at his phone, a decision already made. I trusted explanations because trust felt like strength. Questioning felt disloyal, dramatic, unnecessary, something other couples did. Not us, especially on calm mornings, shared routines, familiar lives, together. I believed knowing someone meant being known. I didn't imagine separate narratives forming under the same roof. Our life felt transparent to me, open and shared. I didn't see the corners where information gathered, waiting, withheld, until it could be used without resistance against me. Quietly, strategically, patiently, intentionally, decisively. Love, to me, meant partnership and shared risk. I trusted the structure we'd built, believing we stood on equal ground. That belief shaped my choices, my patience, my silence. I didn't realize how uneven that ground had become until it finally shifted beneath me slowly, quietly, deliberately, unnoticed, completely, irrevocably. That morning, thinking back on us felt different, heavier. Memories rearranged themselves, losing innocence. The marriage I thought I had still existed, but something else sat beneath it now, unseen before. I sat with that weight, breathing, not yet ready to name it or understand fully. Quietly, patiently, honestly, alone. The signs had been there, scattered lightly through our days, easy to step over without noticing. At the time, they felt like quirks, adjustments, things couples adapt to as years pass and novelty fades into routine, comfort, predictability, something quieter, something less questioned. He started closing doors more often, especially when on his phone. Not slamming them, just gently shutting them with a careful click. I noticed the habit but told myself privacy wasn't secrecy, that everyone deserved small spaces to themselves, even inside a marriage built on trust. Our financial conversations changed subtly. He took over more decisions, speaking confidently, summarizing instead of discussing. I appreciated the relief, thinking it meant partnership, not control. I didn't ask for details, and he didn't offer them, and the silence between those choices grew unnoticed. When I suggested changes, travel plans, home updates, even weekend schedules, he responded with patience that felt rehearsed. He never said no directly. He redirected, postponed, reframed, until my ideas dissolved naturally, without argument, leaving me oddly relieved and vaguely unsatisfied. He became more organized, more structured, labeling folders, locking files, updating passwords. I admired the responsibility. Stability felt reassuring. I didn't question why preparedness suddenly mattered so much, or why those systems didn't include me the way they once had. Our conversations shortened. Not cold, just efficient. He listened, nodded, responded appropriately, but rarely lingered. I filled the gaps, talking enough for both of us, mistaking his quiet for contentment. I didn't realize how often listening can be a way to avoid revealing anything back. I noticed he planned ahead without looping me in. Appointments, deliveries, home services scheduled and completed seamlessly. He explained afterward, casually, as if details were unnecessary. I accepted that explanation because it felt easier than pushing back, easier than admitting discomfort I couldn't fully justify yet. There were moments when I felt like a guest in my own life, walking into a room mid-task, pausing so I wouldn't interrupt, asking before using shared resources, waiting for cues. I told myself I was being considerate, not cautious, but my body knew the difference. He complimented me less on opinions and more on flexibility. He thanked me for being understanding, for not overreacting, for trusting him. Those words felt good, like gold stars for emotional maturity, and I wore them proudly, unaware they rewarded silence more than partnership. When conflicts arose, small ones, he diffused them quickly. Calm voice, logical framing, reassurance delivered efficiently. I rarely left those conversations feeling heard, but I always felt foolish for wanting more. He never dismissed me outright. He just resolved things before my feelings had space to exist. Friends joked that I was the easygoing one. I laughed along, reinforcing the image. Being low maintenance became part of my identity. I didn't realize how often I used that label to excuse unmet needs, convincing myself wanting clarity or involvement meant asking for too much. Even intimacy shifted, becoming scheduled, predictable, less spontaneous. He was present but distant, attentive without vulnerability. I told myself this was normal, that long marriages evolve. I didn't consider that emotional withdrawal can hide behind routine just as easily as chaos. There were questions I swallowed, moments I paused, instincts I softened. Each time I chose peace over curiosity. Not because I feared answers, but because I trusted there was nothing worth uncovering. That trust felt earned, mutual, safe until it wasn't. I remembered once asking about a document I didn't recognize. He smiled, explained it away quickly, and kissed my forehead. The gesture disarmed me. I didn't press further, embarrassed by my suspicion, relieved by his warmth, unaware how effectively affection can redirect attention. Looking back, none of it screamed betrayal. There were no fights, no disappearances, no dramatic shifts, just a gradual narrowing, a quiet restructuring of shared space, emotional and practical, that I adapted to without noticing how much ground I'd ceded. I told myself love meant choosing battles wisely. I believed restraint was maturity. I didn't see how often restraint benefited only one of us. The early warning signs weren't alarms. They were whispers, easily drowned out by routine, trust, and my desire to believe everything was fine. That morning, standing outside my locked home, those whispers grew louder. The past rearranged itself with new clarity, patterns sharpening into meaning. I felt a slow ache of recognition, not panic, just understanding, as if my instincts were finally allowed to speak without being corrected. The anniversary plans had been his idea this year, which felt unusual but welcome. He mentioned dinner downtown weeks earlier, said he wanted to keep it simple, meaningful, just us. I remember smiling, touched by the intention, unaware that simplicity can sometimes hide exclusion rather than intimacy. Normally, I handled details, reservations, timing, little surprises tucked into the day. This time, he waved off my offers to help, saying he had it covered. I took that as care, as effort, not realizing how neatly it removed me from the process entirely. When I asked what time we'd leave, he said we'd figure it out later. When I asked about the restaurant, he said he wanted it to be a surprise. His tone was warm, reassuring, and I didn't push. Surprises felt romantic, not suspicious, especially from someone who rarely planned them. In the days leading up, he was oddly calm. Not excited, not distracted, just steady. I mistook that for confidence. I told myself mature love doesn't need fireworks, that comfort is its own celebration, that not every anniversary needs build-up to matter. I bought a card anyway, one I picked carefully, reading each message slowly. I wrote about gratitude, partnership, growing together. Felt sincere. I folded it neatly and tucked it into my bag, assuming I'd hand it to him over dinner, maybe laughing about how sentimental I sounded. The night before, he went to bed early, said he had a busy morning. I kissed him goodnight, lingered a second longer than usual, feeling something unnameable tug at me. He squeezed my hand, smiled, and turned off the light without another word. That should have been enough to unsettle me, but it wasn't. I trusted him. I trusted the version of us I carried in my head. I trusted that anniversaries, by their nature, were shared milestones, not opportunities for unilateral decisions. Looking back, I realize how many assumptions I made. That plans included me. That surprises were meant to delight, not disarm. That silence meant nothing was wrong. I didn't imagine an anniversary could be used as cover for something else entirely. That morning, outside the locked door, those assumptions collapsed quietly. The plans I'd pictured had never accounted for my presence. Whatever he had arranged, it didn't require me being inside the house, or inside the decision-making, or inside the truth. I replayed our recent conversations, listening for cracks. His calmness felt different now, less like confidence and more like certainty. He knew something I didn't. He had been moving toward an outcome while I'd been standing still, believing we were walking together. The idea that this day had been chosen intentionally sat heavy in my chest. Anniversaries are symbolic. They mark commitment, shared history, continuity. Choosing this morning for secrecy felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, and that realization hurt more than confusion ever could. I wondered when the plans had shifted, when the celebration had become separation. Had I missed a conversation? Had he tried to tell me something I ignored? I searched my memory for signs, desperate to find my own accountability, something to balance the blame. But the truth remained stubborn. I hadn't opted out. I hadn't been consulted. Whatever was unfolding had been decided elsewhere, without my input, without my consent, while I continued living inside an outdated version of our marriage. I felt foolish for packing hope into that day, for assuming love meant inclusion by default, for believing milestones protected you from being sidelined. The card in my bag suddenly felt naive, a relic from a story he'd already rewritten. As the morning stretched on, I stopped thinking about dinner plans altogether. They felt irrelevant now, like props from a play canceled before opening night. What mattered was understanding how long I'd been excluded without noticing. I stood there, keys in hand, heart steady but heavy, and accepted a quiet truth. The anniversary plans had never been for us. They had been for him, And whatever future he was arranging, it no longer centered around the life I thought we shared. I didn't mean to go looking for proof that morning. At first, I only wanted context, something solid to hold on to so I wouldn't spiral into imagined explanations. Standing outside with nowhere else to go, I decided to drive to my office instead of waiting, needing movement, needing walls, needing air that didn't feel accusatory. Once there, the quiet felt different, purposeful. The hum of the lights steadied me as I set my bag down and wrapped my hands around a second cup of coffee. I told myself to focus on work, but my body refused, mind drifting back to the locks, the timing, the certainty in his absence. I remembered then the shared cloud account we rarely used, the one tied to our home projects and insurance. He'd mentioned reorganizing files weeks ago, and curiosity nudged me harder than fear. I logged in, half expecting nothing, half dreading something. The folders looked different. New labels, dates recent, subfolders nested carefully. My pulse quickened as I opened one marked property, a word that felt colder than it should have. Inside were scanned documents I didn't recognize, neat and final, stamped with dates that made my stomach tighten. I scrolled slowly, reading without fully absorbing at first. Forms, agreements, authorizations. His name appeared repeatedly, mine absent where it should have been. I felt a hollow pressure behind my eyes, the kind that comes before tears or clarity, and I forced myself to keep reading. There it was, unmistakable. Paperwork documenting changes made quietly, legally, without my involvement. I noticed timestamps, signatures, confirmations. The work had been done efficiently, professionally, and weeks ago. The realization settled in my chest like a weight I couldn't shift. My hands trembled, but my thoughts sharpened. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't emotional. This was administrative, deliberate, and clean. The locks weren't a reaction. They were a final step. The house wasn't being secured for us. It was being secured from me. I leaned back in my chair, listening to my breath echo too loudly in my ears. The room smelled faintly of dust and printer ink, grounding me as panic threatened. I counted seconds, forced myself to stay still, to let shock pass without taking me with it. I opened another folder, then another. Each one added detail, context, a timeline forming that I hadn't been part of. There were emails saved as PDFs, correspondence with professionals I didn't know, language carefully chosen to exclude ambiguity, and by extension, exclude me. I noticed how calm everything looked. No urgency, no emotion, no conflict. Just steps followed in order. That calmness hurt more than anger would have. It meant this decision hadn't been difficult for him. It had been resolved quietly, long before that morning. I closed the laptop and stared at the wall, noticing a faint crack near the ceiling I'd never paid attention to before. My body felt distant, like I was watching myself process this from somewhere else. The betrayal wasn't loud. It was procedural. I thought about how easily I could have missed this. If I hadn't been locked out, if routine had continued one more day, I might still be unaware, still smiling, still trusting. That knowledge made my throat tighten more than the documents themselves. When I opened the laptop again, I didn't rush. I took notes, dates, file names, details. Not because I knew what I'd do with them yet, but because instinct told me information mattered now more than emotion. Understanding felt safer than reacting. As the morning wore on, shock softened into something steadier. Hurt remained, but it no longer blurred my vision. What I felt instead was clarity. The lock change wasn't personal in the way I'd first feared. It was strategic. By the time I logged out, the coffee had gone cold. I wrapped my hands around the mug anyway, grounding myself in the chill. Whatever this was, it had structure, intention, and a paper trail. And for the first time that morning, I understood exactly where I stood. Once the initial shock settled, the pieces began arranging themselves with an unsettling logic. The locks, the paperwork, the timing all pointed in the same direction, and I finally allowed myself to stop pretending this was a misunderstanding. Understanding arrived slowly, not as panic, but as a cold, clarifying calm. The lock change hadn't been about safety. It wasn't about a forgotten conversation or poor communication. It was about control, about ensuring I couldn't interfere with something already decided. That realization tightened my chest, but it also cleared the fog that had been clinging to me all morning. I replayed his recent behavior with new awareness. The calm voice, the reassurance, the way he deflected questions without refusing outright. It hadn't been kindness. It had been containment. He'd been managing information the way someone manages risk, carefully, selectively, without emotion. I thought about the documents again, how thorough they were. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment choice made in anger. It required planning, advice, foresight. He had anticipated obstacles, and I was one of them. The locks were simply the physical expression of that calculation. That hurt more than betrayal rooted in passion ever could. There was no heat in this, no desperation. Just efficiency. I realized then that whatever he was protecting, it wasn't our relationship. It was an outcome he wanted secured before I could question it. I felt a brief, sharp urge to call him, to demand answers, to reclaim some sense of agency through confrontation. But the urge passed. Instinct told me that reacting now would only give him information, and information was clearly his preferred currency. Instead, I sat quietly and thought, if he had planned this so carefully, then emotion wouldn't undo it. Tears wouldn't reopen doors. What I needed wasn't an argument, but understanding. I needed to know the full scope before I made myself visible again. The realization shifted something fundamental inside me. I stopped seeing myself as someone waiting to be let back in. That framing assumed he held all the power. The truth was more complicated. He had moved first, but that didn't mean the game was over. I reviewed the timeline in my head, noting when things had changed. His new routines. The increased privacy. The way he'd positioned himself as the calm, reasonable one. It wasn't random. It was a pattern I could now see clearly because I wasn't trying to excuse it anymore. That clarity came with grief, but also resolve. I mourned the version of my marriage I thought was real, the trust I'd extended freely. But I also felt something steadier forming beneath the sadness. A sense of footing returning. I understood then why the lock change had happened early. He hadn't wanted to risk a conversation on the actual anniversary. He needed separation before symbolism complicated logistics. Distance first, explanation later, if at all. The day wasn't meant to be shared. Knowing that stripped the moment of its sting. It was no longer a personal rejection. It was a maneuver. Seeing it that way allowed me to step back emotionally, to stop internalizing his choices as reflections of my worth. I took a long breath and noticed how my body felt. Tense, yes, but alert. Focused. I wasn't spiraling anymore. I was observing. That shift felt important, like crossing a threshold from reaction into awareness. I decided not to leave any messages. Not yet. Silence, I realized, could work both ways. If he expected panic or confrontation, withholding it would disrupt his expectations. And disruption, I suspected, was something he hadn't planned for. I closed my notebook and gathered my things, feeling oddly composed. The world outside continued as usual, traffic passing, phones ringing, time moving forward without ceremony. My private crisis didn't stop anything else, and that perspective steadied me further. By the time I stood to leave, I no longer felt locked out. I felt repositioned. The locks had told me exactly where I stood in his plans, and that knowledge, painful as it was, gave me something solid to work with. I walked out into the daylight understanding one clear truth. The locks weren't meant to end a conversation. They were meant to prevent one. And now that I understood that, I knew better than to rush back to the door and ask to be let in. I spent the next few hours in quiet observation, choosing to stay silent rather than react. The house, the locks, the documents, they were all part of a strategy he had set in motion, and I realized that responding emotionally would only play into his hands. Patience, I decided, would be my advantage. I watched him from a distance when possible, noting how he moved through the routines we once shared. He seemed confident, calm, even satisfied, carrying himself with a kind of precision that confirmed my worst suspicions. Every smile, every gesture, every casual glance was now layered with intention, carefully performed to conceal truth. Inside myself, I became meticulous. I cataloged what I knew, what I had seen, and what I could infer. Each piece of information was a tool. Each observation a potential safeguard. For the first time in years, I felt like a strategist rather than a participant, and that clarity was both frightening and empowering. I reviewed my memory of conversations, encounters, and moments I had brushed off as insignificant. Subtle lies, omitted details, and rearranged schedules. All of it fit together in a pattern I hadn't noticed before. I realized how often I had explained things away in the name of love, ignoring instinct, brushing aside unease. I kept busy with small tasks to ground myself. Making lists, checking documents I had access to, even rearranging my workspace gave me a sense of control. My body moved automatically, hands and feet busy, while my mind ran analyses on timelines, motives, and opportunities. Every movement was purposeful. I noticed his routines from a distance, the early departures, the phone calls, the extra care in how he spoke. Nothing screamed guilt, yet everything confirmed the deception. I didn't confront. I didn't accuse. I simply watched, absorbing, remembering, and calculating. There were moments I felt the old anger rise, sharp and hot, demanding release. I stilled it. Anger now was a liability, a tool he could use against me. So I breathed slowly, letting my awareness sharpen instead of clouding my judgment. I learned how to feel without acting, how to acknowledge pain without letting it dictate choices. I began recording small details, notes, timestamps, patterns, subtle behavior, repeated movements, phone calls, deliveries, purchases. Every fact mattered. Knowledge was the shield I had lacked in past misunderstandings, and I wasn't about to make that mistake again. Even while silent, I felt him testing me. Subtle glances, casual remarks, the way he arranged objects in the house as if rehearsed. I noticed them, documented them mentally, and refused to react. He expected surprise, confusion, or pleading. I gave him none of those. I realized the importance of timing. Acting too soon would expose me. Waiting would give me leverage. Patience was no longer passive, it was strategy. I allowed the hours to stretch, letting him operate under the assumption that I remained unaware, compliant, or dependent. Each observation strengthened resolve. I felt a new type of calm, one rooted in focus rather than ignorance. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't desperate. I was collecting, recording, and understanding, building a foundation for decisions that would matter far more than any immediate reaction. Even small details became significant. The way he handled mail, the schedule of visitors, the subtle changes in tone during calls. All of it informed the bigger picture. He assumed secrecy gave him control. I assumed observation gave me understanding. By mid-afternoon, I could see the full scope in fragments. He had planned meticulously, but in doing so, he had left a trail of evidence, patterns I could follow if I chose. Silence had revealed what confrontation would have hidden. Observation was giving me clarity, a calm authority over the situation. I found moments of reflection too. Sitting with coffee, listening to the faint hum of life outside, I acknowledged hurt, betrayal, and disbelief. But I paired each emotion with a note. Watch, wait, document. Each feeling became fuel for awareness rather than a trigger for rash action. By the end of the day, I understood one key truth. Knowledge, patience, and observation were my most powerful tools. I didn't need to confront him to regain agency. I simply needed to see clearly, act deliberately, and allow the situation to unfold under my watchful attention. In that silence, I became more than the betrayed spouse. I became deliberate, aware, and prepared. I had learned to sit quietly while gathering every fact, every subtle cue, every piece of the puzzle. And in that quiet, I felt a small but steady sense of power return to me. The deeper I looked, the more I realized the betrayal extended beyond the walls of our home. It wasn't just about locks, documents, or early morning surprises. There were other players, people I had trusted, connections I hadn't questioned, quietly participating in his plan without my knowledge. I noticed subtle changes in interactions with friends and family. Invitations that once included me now arrived after the fact. Conversations shifted when I entered the room. Small glances exchanged, brief pauses, muted tones, all seemingly insignificant until I traced them back to the days leading up to the lock change. Even our closest friends had become part of a narrative I wasn't allowed to see. They offered advice or support that aligned more with his interests than mine. I realized with a sinking feeling that the betrayal wasn't isolated to the two of us. It had spread slowly through networks I assumed were neutral. The sense of exposure was chilling. I had believed I understood the people around me, that our inner circle shared values and priorities. Now I saw how quietly alliances can shift, how loyalties can be assumed rather than confirmed. That realization left me hyper-aware, tense, scanning for subtle patterns everywhere. I reflected on past gatherings, casual conversations, the way jokes had landed differently on some days. Innocent laughter now seemed staged, cues rehearsed. Even small mentions of family events or household decisions had been manipulated, guiding my perception without overt confrontation, subtly isolating me from insight. I began documenting patterns meticulously. Notes, timelines, observations. Each instance of exclusion or subtle manipulation became data. I mapped visits, messages, and behaviors, comparing them against what I knew and trusted. Slowly, the network of involvement became clear, a lattice of decisions and actions that extended beyond him alone. The realization stung deeper than personal betrayal. There was a social dimension, a reputational risk I hadn't considered. What if others had unknowingly reinforced his choices? What if his plan included shaping perceptions so that when the truth emerged, I would appear irrational or overly dramatic? That thought sharpened my awareness. I felt a mix of fear and resolve. Fear because the situation was bigger than anticipated, and resolve because understanding the scope meant I could respond intelligently. I wasn't powerless. I simply had to navigate carefully, taking in more information before deciding my next steps. I observed his behavior closely. Each interaction was calculated, whether with family, colleagues, or acquaintances. He spoke confidently, smiled when appropriate, deflected without revealing intent. Everything reinforced my earlier conclusion. The lock change and associated secrecy were part of a coordinated, long-term plan. I realized the danger wasn't physical but strategic. This was about control, about narrative, about ensuring outcomes aligned with his interests. Awareness was my only protection. Reacting emotionally would play into his strategy. Observing, documenting, and analyzing became my tools for safety and leverage. Even in this tense awareness, I reminded myself not to let panic creep in. Clarity required composure. I practiced breathing slowly, noting each subtle movement, each gesture, each anomaly. Every detail mattered. Every small observation added to my understanding of what I was up against. I also became aware of how easily trust can be weaponized. People I assumed neutral or loyal had acted in ways that favored his plan. That awareness was humbling. I realized my previous assumptions about loyalty, openness, and shared goals had blinded me to subtle manipulation. I documented emails, phone calls, and conversations that seemed harmless at first but now appeared significant. Even jokes or casual remarks carried weight when traced against patterns. I understood the importance of data in reclaiming agency, of facts over emotion, observation over impulse. By the afternoon, I could see a network forming in my mind, a map of influence and intention. The betrayal wasn't isolated. It was systemic. Knowing that allowed me to move mentally from victimhood to strategy. I wasn't powerless. I was informed. The emotional progression was subtle but real. Shock became clarity, hurt became focus, confusion became analysis. I felt my body relax slightly, not because the danger diminished, but because understanding replaced uncertainty. Knowledge, I realized, was my strongest shield. By evening, I had a sense of the full scope. The betrayal had reach, influence, and foresight. Yet I wasn't defeated. In fact, being aware gave me a measure of control I hadn't had before. The network of involvement didn't weaken me. It gave me the map I needed to navigate, respond, and reclaim agency. I knew then that my next steps had to be deliberate. Acting hastily would play into his hands, and reacting emotionally would only confirm the narrative he had carefully constructed. Patience, observation, and preparation became my silent allies, shaping each decision I made that day. I began contacting professionals quietly, people I trusted to provide guidance without raising alarms. Lawyers, financial advisors, and a few discreet consultants were looped in, not with panic but with calm, fact-based requests for advice. Each call reinforced that I could act strategically without losing control. I reviewed the documents again, this time with focused attention. Dates, signatures, and procedures were meticulously logged. Any discrepancies, omissions, or irregularities were highlighted. I realized that understanding the mechanics of his actions was more empowering than confronting him impulsively ever could be. I also started organizing my own records, past communications, receipts, messages, anything that could support clarity or legal protection were cataloged. My home office became a command center of sorts, each folder representing a small piece of the puzzle, each note a shield against uncertainty. Emotionally, I felt a shift. Initial shock and hurt were still present, but they were tempered by a growing sense of agency. I wasn't reacting out of fear anymore. I was planning, observing, and waiting. That calm determination carried weight, a quiet power that he hadn't anticipated. I considered my environment carefully. Every movement, every action was measured. I avoided unnecessary contact, limiting opportunities for misinterpretation. Even my body language became intentional, projecting neutrality, calm, and awareness without revealing the full extent of my understanding. During calls with advisors, I listened more than I spoke. I absorbed information, asked clarifying questions, and took notes meticulously. Their insights helped me anticipate potential pitfalls, and I realized that planning for worst-case scenarios gave me a strange sense of security I hadn't expected to feel. I also reflected on what I needed personally. Time, clarity, and focus became priorities. I scheduled moments to step outside, breathe, and observe without distraction. Even brief pauses allowed me to maintain composure, recalibrate my emotions, and remain strategically aware of the unfolding situation. I reviewed the timeline of his recent actions. Lock changes, document updates, subtle shifts in behavior, and social interactions all fit into a coherent sequence. Recognizing patterns rather than isolated events gave me confidence that I could predict potential next moves, reducing anxiety and increasing control. I avoided confrontation deliberately. Each time I felt the urge to call or text, I reminded myself that information was my advantage. Acting prematurely could expose my knowledge, giving him time to adjust his plans. Silence became my tool, observation my weapon, patience my strategy. I also began mentally rehearsing potential scenarios. How he might respond if confronted, what actions could escalate or defuse tension, and how to maintain composure under scrutiny. Each mental exercise reinforced my awareness, allowing me to anticipate rather than react. Even mundane tasks were approached with focus. Cooking, organizing, and walking the dog became ways to stay grounded, while my mind ran through sequences and contingencies. The normalcy of routine contrasted with the intensity of observation, keeping me steady and alert simultaneously. I documented subtle behavioral cues, gestures, and interactions. How he handled his phone, spoke to others, or arranged items in the house. All these details became part of my broader understanding. Observation replaced speculation, facts replaced fear, and clarity replaced confusion. By evening, I had assembled a full picture of the morning's events, the broader context, and my options moving forward. I felt calm but vigilant, aware but not reactive. I realized that preparation and strategy had shifted the balance of control in my favor without confrontation, without drama, without risk. As I went to bed that night, I felt a sense of quiet empowerment. I had protected myself, gathered critical knowledge, and established a plan without alerting him. The day had been exhausting emotionally, but intellectually it had been clarifying. I slept with the comfort of awareness, ready for whatever came next. The next morning, I woke with a quiet determination I hadn't felt before. The betrayal weighed on me, but it no longer clouded my thinking. I understood that the situation required careful navigation rather than emotion-fueled confrontation. Patience and observation remained my guiding principles. I returned to the house under the guise of daily routine. Neighbors going about their mornings, the distant hum of traffic, and the smell of fresh dew on grass provided normalcy I clung to. Each step I took was deliberate, measured, as I approached the front door with calm resolve. The lock still stood as a barrier, but now it felt less like imprisonment and more like a signal. It told me precisely how far the plan had gone, the boundaries drawn without my consent. I studied it closely, noting scratches, alignment, and any imperfections that could be leveraged later. I began observing his interactions more closely. Every word, every gesture, every casual glance was data. He was confident, moving as if nothing had changed, which only confirmed the depth of his planning. He expected me to be caught off guard, to react emotionally, but I no longer fell into that trap. I noticed subtle signals that hadn't registered before. A phone tucked carefully out of sight, the careful positioning of documents, the way he arranged household items to convey order and control. Each small detail reinforced that he had calculated his moves well in advance. I continued documenting everything meticulously. Notes, dates, behaviors, all were recorded in a notebook I carried with me. Patterns emerged. Times, sequences, priorities, interactions. These small threads began weaving a larger picture, giving me insight into both his intentions and potential vulnerabilities. Even ordinary tasks became exercises in observation. I cooked breakfast while noting which doors he left open, how he moved through the house, what items he carried, and where he placed them. Every routine action became a clue, and I treated it as such quietly without alarm. I realized the betrayal had a broader scope than I initially thought. It wasn't just about control of the house or exclusion from decisions. It involved influence over people and narratives around me. Friends, family, acquaintances, all seemed to participate unconsciously in maintaining his advantage. That understanding deepened my caution. I spoke to no one unnecessarily and avoided giving away any sense of urgency or knowledge. Silence became a strategy, not just a defense. Observation was my tool, and patience was my strength. I reviewed past incidents with a sharper lens. Conversations that once seemed benign now appeared carefully managed. Subtle redirections, delayed responses, selective disclosure, all were techniques he had used to maintain control while keeping me unaware. I felt the first real stirrings of strategic resolve. Anger was present but restrained. Hurt was acknowledged but channeled. I understood that responding impulsively would be counterproductive. Instead, I could turn knowledge into leverage, timing into advantage. I continued mapping his routine, noting inconsistencies or moments of predictability. Even small patterns mattered. How he checked his phone, what times he stepped outside, how he handled deliveries. Each detail added to my understanding and my sense of control. Emotionally, I felt a strange combination of vulnerability and empowerment. Vulnerable because the betrayal cut deep, but empowered because awareness granted agency. I could see the mechanisms at play, anticipate his moves, and plan carefully without being detected. I also began mentally rehearsing responses to potential confrontations. What to say, how to appear calm, how to extract information without revealing that I knew. Each rehearsal sharpened focus and reduced anxiety, preparing me to act strategically rather than impulsively. By the end of the day, I felt grounded in a quiet certainty. I knew where I stood, what I knew, and how to proceed. The lock was a symbol, the documents were proof, and my awareness was the foundation. I had reclaimed my power, not through confrontation, but through careful observation, documentation, and patience. I finally confronted the truth I had been bracing for, though I still hadn't spoken a word to him. Everything I had observed, documented, and analyzed led to a single, undeniable realization. The betrayal had a purpose far beyond exclusion. It was a calculated plan, a deliberate reshaping of our shared life without my input. I revisited the documents one last time, tracing every signature, every date, every procedural step. Patterns emerged clearly, showing foresight, careful timing, and meticulous orchestration. Nothing was left to chance. Every action had been designed to secure control and preempt interference. Then I reviewed the financial records, the agreements, and the contracts. There it was, evidence of decisions made entirely in his name, with authority he had quietly assumed, leaving me absent from choices that directly affected our assets, property, and future. The scale of the betrayal hit fully, cold, and precise. I realized that he hadn't just changed locks or excluded me physically. He had altered the balance of our lives. Decisions about money, property, and social perception had been finalized long before I knew there was anything to consider. The anniversary had been chosen symbolically to mark the culmination of the plan. Emotions swelled in waves. Instead, hurt, I let the truth settle, and observing how it felt physically. I allowed myself to feel it, in my chest, I didn't act on impulse. Heat behind my eyes, hands that trembled subtly. I acknowledged it without letting it dictate my next moves. I revisited my notes, connecting all the behaviors, documents, and subtle patterns. Early departures, private calls, selective disclosure, orchestrated routines. All pieces fell into place. What had seemed like minor inconsistencies or quirks now revealed themselves as deliberate tools for achieving a specific outcome. I understood his thinking clearly for the first time. The calm, confident demeanor, the strategic silences, the orchestrated routines. It wasn't about kindness or pragmatism. It was about controlling the narrative, preserving advantage, and removing me from the equation without confrontation. I felt a quiet anger, but it was precise, targeted. This wasn't a flailing emotional betrayal. It was methodical. Knowing that allowed me to separate my feelings from my strategy. I could be hurt and still act logically. I could be betrayed and still reclaim agency. I also recognized the subtle genius of his timing. The anniversary, a day I expected connection, had been transformed into a symbolic assertion of control. Everything had been executed to minimize disruption to him while maximizing my initial confusion. That understanding steeled my resolve. I documented everything I had learned in one comprehensive file. Facts, timelines, patterns, interactions, and behaviors were cataloged meticulously. For the first time, I had a complete map of his actions, intentions, and networks. Knowledge was no longer partial, it was total. I reflected on my own behavior leading up to this revelation. How often had I dismissed unease? How often had I assumed routine meant stability? The awareness was painful but empowering. I recognized that my own assumptions had created space for his plan to flourish. I felt a surge of strategic clarity. This wasn't about revenge born of rage. It was about reclaiming control intelligently, using knowledge as leverage, planning moves deliberately, and protecting myself without playing into his design. I had the facts. I had the insight. I had the patience. Even as emotions lingered, I felt steadier than I had all morning. Pain and clarity coexisted, and the latter allowed me to act with purpose rather than reaction. Understanding the scope of the betrayal gave me the foundation I needed for what came next. By late afternoon, I realized the truth was no longer hidden. The documents, the patterns, the behavior, they all told the same story. I could see everything, understand everything, and plan everything. The locks, the secrecy, the planning. All of it had prepared me, unintentionally, to finally recognize the full measure of what had been done. And with that recognition came the first hint of empowerment. The truth was devastating, but it was also actionable. I could no longer be blindsided. I could no longer be maneuvered. I could see clearly, and that clarity would guide me forward. That I spent the evening sitting at the small kitchen table, the one we used to share coffee at every morning. The light above hummed faintly, and the smell of cold toast lingered in the air. Everything felt familiar, yet distant, like a memory I was still inside of. I didn't call anyone. Not my sister, not my closest friend, not even the neighbor who always asked questions. Silence felt safer than explaining something I was still arranging inside myself. I needed the quiet to think clearly. I replayed our last few months together, not with nostalgia, but with precision. I noticed how often he redirected conversations, how his eyes lingered on his phone during serious talks. Those moments hadn't felt alarming then, just slightly off. There was a pattern in how he minimized my concerns. He never denied them outright, just softened them until I doubted my own instincts. That slow erosion now stood out as deliberate, almost rehearsed. I walked through the house carefully, touching familiar surfaces. The couch arm was worn where I always sat. The hallway rug still curled at the corner. Each detail grounded me, reminding me that this life had been real, not imagined. In the bedroom, I opened drawers I hadn't checked in years. Receipts, spare keys, folded papers I didn't recognize sat quietly in place. None of it was dramatic, but all of it mattered. I realized how much of my trust had been built on routine. Shared meals, shared plans, shared laughter had convinced me we were aligned. I hadn't considered that routine could be used as cover. What surprised me most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was how calm I felt now that I understood it. The confusion had hurt more than the truth ever could. I sat on the edge of the bed and let that calm settle. My breathing slowed, and the tension in my shoulders eased slightly. This was clarity, even if it came at a cost. I thought about how often I'd prioritized harmony over honesty, how I'd smooth things over to keep peace, even when something felt wrong. That habit had kept me comfortable but also vulnerable. For the first time, I didn't rush to forgive or explain. I didn't search for excuses on his behalf. I allowed the facts to exist without decoration. Outside, a car passed slowly, tires hissing on the street. Life continued normally for everyone else, unaware of the shift happening quietly inside me. That contrast felt strange but grounding. I understood now that this wasn't about winning or losing. It was about seeing clearly and choosing myself without apology. That realization felt steady, not sharp. I gathered my notes and placed them neatly in a folder. Organization gave me a sense of control I hadn't realized I needed. Each page represented awareness, not anger. I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the expression. My eyes looked tired, but focused. There was strength there I hadn't noticed before. I didn't know exactly what I would say when we finally spoke. I only knew I wouldn't be shrinking or guessing anymore. That certainty felt new. As the night grew quieter, I made myself a cup of tea. The warmth in my hands was comforting, simple, real. Small things still worked even now. I accepted that some answers would come later. I didn't need them all tonight. What mattered was that I finally trusted myself again. When I turned off the lights, the house felt different, but not hostile. It was just a space waiting for new decisions. I went to bed knowing that whatever came next, I would meet it awake, aware, and steady. Lying there, I listened to the faint creaks of the house settling. Those sounds used to annoy me, but now they felt like quiet company. They reminded me I wasn't alone, even in this moment. I let myself feel the disappointment without rushing past it. Not the dramatic kind, just the dull ache of expectation unmet. It was honest and it didn't overwhelm me. I thought about the woman I had been when I first moved into this house. She believed love was proven through patience and compromise. She hadn't yet learned the cost of ignoring her own voice. That version of me had done her best with what she knew. I didn't blame her for trusting deeply or hoping fiercely. Growth didn't require shame, only acknowledgement. As sleep edged closer, my thoughts slowed into something gentler. I focused on the steady rhythm of my breathing. Tomorrow could wait just for now. I allowed myself one small promise before drifting off. I would no longer confuse silence with safety. That promise settled into me, quiet and firm. It felt like the beginning of something truer inside. Morning came with a soft light that filtered through the blinds, pale and deliberate. I moved slowly, intentionally, carrying with me the clarity I had gathered the night before. There was no rush, no confrontation, only careful planning and quiet observation. I began the day by reviewing my notes, organizing them with precision. Each detail, from documents to patterns of behavior, was cataloged. My strategy was no longer reactive, it was deliberate, informed by facts rather than emotion. I considered my options carefully. Confrontation would be premature. Legal or financial action required evidence and preparation. But there was another avenue I could explore. Subtle, quiet justice that didn't rely on anger or violence. Intelligence and patience would be my tools. I made small, seemingly innocuous adjustments in my routine. I began managing communications more deliberately, redirecting calls, archiving emails, ensuring that my own observations remained private. The power of knowledge, I realized, was only as strong as the discretion used to wield it. I set up systems to track his movements and behaviors without overt monitoring. Notes, dates, patterns, and small details became a ledger of insight. Each entry strengthened my understanding and my ability to respond with precision rather than impulse. I began reclaiming parts of the home he had quietly controlled. Not through confrontation, but by asserting small, deliberate choices, arranging spaces according to my preference, keeping my schedule firm, and maintaining boundaries without announcing them. These small acts felt like gentle resistance. I cultivated my network quietly. Friends, professionals, and confidants were updated selectively, not to incite panic but to ensure that, if necessary, I had support and clarity on my side. Each connection was deliberate, each conversation purposeful. I also took care of myself physically and emotionally. Exercise, walks, and small indulgences became part of my routine, not as escape, but as preparation. A clear mind and steady body were as crucial as any document or observation in regaining control. I reflected on the power of observation. He had acted strategically, and so could I. By remaining calm, patient, and deliberate, I turned his own tools against him. Careful planning and attention to detail became my assets as well. Every interaction became an opportunity to test his assumptions. Casual comments, minor adjustments, and subtle inquiries were carefully deployed. I observed his reactions, measuring intent, gauging overconfidence, and finding gaps in his narrative. I began implementing small actions that would slowly shift balance back toward me. Adjusting timelines, quietly confirming agreements, and reclaiming authority over shared decisions. All done subtly to avoid triggering resistance or alerting him prematurely. I avoided drama entirely. Every step was calculated, invisible, deliberate. The objective was control, understanding, and eventual correction, not spectacle. I wanted intelligence, not confrontation, to drive the outcome. I monitored patterns over the day. His routines, communications, and behaviors were all predictable when approached with calm awareness. I marked anomalies, small deviations that could provide leverage later if needed. By evening, I felt a quiet satisfaction. My actions had been invisible yet purposeful. I had begun reclaiming agency in ways he hadn't anticipated. Knowledge, patience, and strategic planning were returning the balance without a single raised voice. I prepared myself mentally for future conversations. I didn't need to speak immediately. What mattered was that when the time came, I would be deliberate, informed, and unshaken, able to assert my position without drama or fear. That night, I reflected on the idea of justice without confrontation. True reclamation didn't require aggression. It required foresight, patience, and intelligent action. The quiet revenge I had begun was methodical, deliberate, and entirely under my control. Finally, I allowed myself a small sense of relief. The house felt less like a trap and more like a space where I could operate, think, and reclaim my authority. The morning's betrayal no longer dictated my day. It had become a framework for measured, quiet justice. The next morning, I woke with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in weeks. The betrayal still lingered, but it no longer held power over me. I had acted strategically, observed closely, and reclaimed pieces of control that had been quietly taken from me. That knowledge felt like armor. I moved through the house deliberately, touching surfaces, noting small details, but without fear or hesitation. The locks no longer represented exclusion. They were evidence, a reminder of what had happened and of the clarity I had gained. Each door, each object, each corner was now a measure of my regained agency. I reflected on the lessons this experience had forced me to learn. Trust is vital, but so is awareness. Love is meaningful, but it cannot excuse exclusion or manipulation. Silence can protect, but observation is power. Each of these truths now guided my daily actions and decisions. I began to rebuild routines with intention. Breakfast, coffee, and morning walks became spaces for clarity and calm, not opportunity for confusion or anxiety. Each small act of self-care reinforced the sense of stability I was reclaiming. I reached out selectively, connecting with trusted professionals and friends who had offered advice. The conversations were measured, practical, and intentional. I didn't need reassurance. I needed confirmation that my understanding of events was accurate, and each exchange reinforced my strategy. Emotionally, I felt a slow shift. The raw hurt and shock had faded into awareness, and the awareness carried a quiet strength. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't vengeful in a reckless sense. I was focused, intentional, and prepared to protect my life, property, and peace of mind. I revisited the anniversary card I had prepared weeks ago. I smiled faintly at my own sentimentality, recognizing it as part of the woman I had been. Trusting, hopeful, invested. That version of myself had been blindsided, but she had taught me to act with empathy and intelligence, not impulsiveness. I considered my husband's role in all of this. He had acted deliberately, efficiently, and without regard for my inclusion. I acknowledged his intelligence, even as I refused to admire the betrayal. Recognizing his strategy allowed me to anticipate future actions without letting fear take hold. By afternoon, I felt fully present in my own life again. Each decision, no matter how small, carried intention. I no longer allowed assumptions or habits to dictate my actions. I was aware, grounded, and deliberate, and that awareness had become my strength. I reflected on the broader implications of what had happened. Betrayal isn't always violent or overt. It can be quiet, methodical, and administrative. Recognizing it requires attention, observation, and willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. That recognition had transformed me. I began considering the long-term path forward. Boundaries, transparency, and personal agency became priorities. I didn't need dramatic confrontation or vindictive gestures. I needed control over my own life, clear understanding, and the ability to act with foresight and precision. I made mental notes for conversations that might come later, planning how to remain composed, assertive, and informed. I would no longer be caught off guard, and I would speak only when I had certainty and leverage. Patience had proven its value. By evening, I took a quiet walk outside. The neighborhood was calm, children playing at a distance, leaves rustling in the wind. The world moved steadily, unconcerned with the intricacies of my personal struggles. That indifference felt liberating. I realized that healing and empowerment could coexist with awareness. I could acknowledge betrayal, protect myself, and still retain compassion and clarity. That balance was the true lesson of what I had endured. Before bed, I organized my notes and records, placing them safely for future reference. Knowledge remained my anchor, and preparation my safeguard. I no longer feared surprises or manipulation because I had regained foresight. Lying down, I allowed myself a final reflection. Life doesn't always follow the paths we expect. Trust, love, and routine can be challenged unexpectedly. But resilience, intelligence, and deliberate action create a life we can control, even when others attempt to undermine it. Sleep came slowly, but peacefully. I felt ready for the days ahead, aware of past lessons, and confident in my ability to navigate whatever came next. Betrayal had changed me, but it had not broken me. I had reclaimed myself fully. If you've ever felt blindsided by someone you trusted, or faced a betrayal that shook your world, remember, awareness, patience, and careful action can help you regain control. If you want more true life stories of resilience, revenge, and personal empowerment, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that could change the way you see trust, betrayal, and strength. And if this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your experiences and how you overcame moments of deception and betrayal. Your story could inspire someone else to take back their power. Finally, don't forget to like this video if you found it compelling, and check out our playlist of similar true life revelations. You won't believe what people endure and how they reclaim their lives.